We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Marcia Nelson. I'm an Executive Fellow at the School of Public Policy, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. The School of Public Policy is Canada's leading policy school, known for our practical and applied research, and the school is currently undertaking a research program to explore the potential for an ambitious national project, the Canadian Northern Corridor. The Canadian Corridor is envisioned as a network of multimodal rights-of-way across the middle and northern parts of Canada, with an accompanying policy, regulatory, and governance structure. The corridor would promote space for the coordinated development of infrastructure such as road, rail, electrical transmission, pipelines, and communications. The Canadian Northern Corridor Research Program is a flagship research program for the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. The purpose of the program is to provide the information and analysis necessary to establish the feasibility and desirability of permissible corridors in Canada. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have to leave early, recordings of the webinar are posted on the School of Public Policy's website, and you'll receive a link to that site in the follow-up email after the webinar program. And I would ask that you type in your questions into the Q&A box below on your screen, and I'll do my best to pose them to our speakers if we have time for all of them during the Q&A portion of the discussion. So for today's presentation, we have Drs Trevor Tombe, Kent Fellows, and Alaz Munzur here to discuss the implications of an infrastructure corridor for Alberta's economy. Welcome, panel, and over to you, Kent.
Thanks very much, Marcia. Good morning, everybody. The presentation, Trevor and I are going to present some prepared slides, and then we'll move into the Q&A portion, as Marcia mentioned. So I think I've got control of the slides now. Give me a second. There's always an unfortunate lag with these things. There we go. Okay. So hopefully you guys can all see what I can see. Marcia gave a great introduction to the Northern Corridor program, but I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on some particulars that are relevant for the discussion we're going to have today, which is the impact on Alberta's economy. And so, as mentioned, the idea behind the corridor is a set of multimodal rights of way, and I think really critical to our discussion today, with an accompanying administrative or institutional structure to actually govern the corridor. Now, the research program stage that we're at now, we're not at the point yet where we're looking at specific pieces of infrastructure or specific paths. So the discussion we're going to have today is generally about what does Alberta look like if we've got better access or better ability to construct different modes of transportation. And in particular, we're going to talk about rail. But I think we could easily have a broader conversation, and part of the paper delves into that, about generally lowering transportation costs, what that looks like. So again, some key points off the top. Don't forget that this is about an institutional structure as well. And when we talk about a corridor, what we're really talking about is rights of way to facilitate construction of different modes of transportation, including road, rail, pipeline, telecommunications infrastructure, and electricity transmission, not to mention any host of other modes that could feasibly go into a corridor in terms of linear infrastructure. And so with that, I think I'll turn it over to Trevor to talk about the trade patterns, and I'll follow up at the end with some of our projections. So Trevor, take it away. You're on mute, Trevor. I'm going to give him another couple of seconds here. If he can't get on, maybe I'll take it away. Dead air never works out great.
I've seen a note that Trevor can't unmute his machine, so I think it's over to you, Kent and Alaz.
Okay, we'll wait and see. Trevor, if you get yourself unmuted, go ahead and introduce.
There we go.
Oh, there we go. He's got it. Good.
Our background host came to my rescue, thankfully. Okay.
It's good to have good tech people.
Thank you, Kent. And thank you to everyone for being here with us today. So I guess before diving into a discussion of the potential implications of an infrastructure corridor for Alberta's economy, I think it's important to review just broadly some of the trade patterns that we see here in Alberta, how it compares to others, how it varies across sectors, because ultimately increased infrastructure capacity, whatever it is, road, rail, and so on, is a way to lower the cost of trading goods and services between Alberta and other provinces, and indeed Alberta and the rest of the world. So first, just what we're looking at here is an illustration of just how important internal trade is for economies in Canada. And Alberta is, like other large provinces, also one that is engaged in a lot of interprovincial trade. Roughly about 1/3, about 27% on average, of production is exported nationally, and about 31% of production in Alberta is exported as well. And that's split between international exports in red and interprovincial exports in blue. So nationally, about 10% of every dollar that is produced in provincial economies around Canada is exported to another province, also within Canada, or I should say province or territory. On the import side, which we're not going to illustrate here, it's also fairly similar, where overall about 28% of total spending on goods and services is allocated to imports, and about 10% of that is on imports from another province. And this does vary a lot across sectors. So Alberta's resource sector in particular, exports are very important for it. About 3/4 of its production are exported elsewhere. And that is a higher share than what you see for Canada as a whole. But when you look at where our exports, where our exports go, you see that the markets that Alberta producers serve are very heavily concentrated. Indeed, compared to other economies in Canada, Alberta's trade is really the least diverse, if you will, in terms of the markets that we serve. This is, of course, largely driven by the configuration of energy transportation infrastructure networks and pipelines that disproportionately lead to the Midwest. But you see here that of the $103 billion in exports that Alberta had, about 88% of it went to the United States. And that was itself dominated by just a few states within the US. Illinois, Texas, and Washington alone account for 1/3 of Alberta's total exports. This is just a way to illustrate that infrastructure matters a lot for who we trade with, because ultimately that determines the costs for firms to trade with others. Now, zeroing in on the infrastructure that we are going to focus on through the rest of the talk is rail in particular. So this is an important mode of transportation for goods leaving Alberta. And here what we're looking at is the latest data that we have on trade at the shipment level that distinguishes between air, truck, rail. And what we're reporting here is rail's share of each sector's total shipments. And what you're seeing is that rail for agriculture exports from Alberta is particularly important. About 55% of exports shipped out from Alberta are on rail. But at other sectors, it's important too. Fuel, crude oil, about 1/4 of that. Coal, basically all coal is exported by rail. About 1/3 of petrochemicals and waste and scrap is exported as well. And we also produce a little bit of transport equipment here, and that is shipped out, export about 17% of it by rail. So rail does matter for exports of certain sectors more than others, certainly. But if we can expand the capacity of rail, then this is going to benefit some sectors more than others by lowering the costs of trade. And to illustrate how much of a trade cost reduction we might be able to achieve, it's good to distinguish the costs of road and rail for different distances. That's what we're doing here. We unpack this in a little bit more rigor and detail in the paper itself, which you can see on policyschool.ca, but just visually, this is a good way to summarize some of the core results that we have. You notice that for short distances in the tens or 100 or 200 kilometer distances, turns out trucks are a cheaper way to go. But as distances expand, and this is a log scale, so each increment that you move up is a doubling of the distance, you see that the costs of shipping by rail increase more slowly than the costs of shipping by road. So that for distances above about 400 kilometers, 400 or 500 kilometers or so, then rail is cheaper than trucks. So given Canada, its vast geography and the great distances between where Alberta producers are and the customers abroad for the high, long distance shipments, rail can be significantly cheaper. So what we end up doing in our analysis is trying to quantify how much trade costs facing Alberta firms and consumers would change under different scenarios. And we explore a wide variety of scenarios in the paper, but one of the core ones that we're going to highlight in a moment involve us increasing the share of shipments exported from Alberta by rail by about 10 percentage points or so. And so to walk us through how we quantify the economic gains from increased rail capacity and therefore lower trade costs, I'm going to turn it back over to Kent to describe that more fully for you.
Thanks, Trevor. So as we start talking about, these rail shipments, I think one point to make clear is we view this as one potential scenario, and it's a nice one to model. And the reason we wanted to model it is because we can put real numbers on that, which I'll show you in the final slide. But if we think about how a transportation corridor is going to impact Alberta, obviously there are going to be multiple effects on multiple different modes, whether that means potentially more pipeline. That's not a primary focus, but that's something that would come through some more pipeline access or more telecommunications for goods that aren't physical goods. All of these things could be rolled up into the idea of a corridor. Now, with that being said, we focused on rail because we've got good data on rail. We can check the differences on modes. So once we went through and came through with this idea of doing rail, and we had the background data Trevor's talked about in terms of the different costs for rail versus road shipping, and we came up with that 10% number, which we think is a reasonable number. Now we can go into actually simulating what does that mean for the economy of Alberta. And in particular, I'm going to focus here on the GDP metric, but there are a bunch of different metrics. We could talk about job creation or capital income. All these kinds of things are all possible to model. So the model we're using for these simulations is called a general equilibrium model, or more specifically, a computational general equilibrium model. And when I say that, I mean, it's easy for, economists might have an idea of what I'm talking about, but it sounds like this big complex thing. So I wanted to give you guys a really quick crash course in what actually is a computational general equilibrium model, these kinds of models that we use to simulate large-scale economic impacts. So they're based on this fairly familiar concept in economics of an equilibrium, right? And so any of you in the audience who sort of remember your undergraduate economics, or depending on where you took it in high school, maybe that as well, this graph should be familiar to you. It's a standard supply and demand graph, right? And the joke always in undergraduate economics, at least when I went through, it's a nerdy joke, is where's the answer in economics? Oh, it's where the lines cross. That's the equilibrium. So you get an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity for a single market out of this graph. And so when I say general equilibrium, all that means is that instead of looking at one market by itself, which we do with these simple graphs, we're looking at all markets at the same time. That's the idea of a general equilibrium versus a partial equilibrium. So what a computational general equilibrium model is it's just one model where we're stitching together several supply and demand graphs, several supply and demand functions. So we just have one for every single market we can model in the economy. We stitch them all together, recognizing that demand in one sector can be driven, or supply in one sector becomes something that fulfills demand in another sector. So if you're building that transportation equipment that Trevor was talking about, you may be bringing in steel. So you have a demand for steel, but that becomes part of your supply, and then you produce that, and onward it goes. So what we do here is we shock the model by changing the transportation costs in the model. So what happens is demand for the traded goods increases as the cost falls. The economy also gets a little bit more efficient because we can produce more valuable goods with the same resources. When we put the same amount of capital and labor into a sector, we get a more valuable output because we can sell it and we don't have to pay as much, or we don't have to incur as much cost to transport it between regions. And so I think I've got control here. Flipping to the next slide, but there's always a lag. My mouth got ahead of the slides there for a second. So when we shock that model, what we get is we get these GDP projections in different provinces and different regions. And so looking specifically Alberta, if we reduce that trade cost, what happens? Well, we model this both for the short run and for the long run. So in the short run, we're restricting the model and saying we can't add any new production, we can't add any new capital. The resources we have in the province right now, land, labor, capital, natural resources, those are fixed. And so what's the impact of that? So no labor flows, no new capital. And we already see some pretty significant impacts. You know, if you are increasing rail share of these particular sectors that rely on rail by 10%, you're getting an increase in GDP of sort of 1 to 1.5%. And that's not a trivial amount. I know 1 to 2% sounds small, but that's a pretty significant economic impact for what would be most likely not a negligible investment in new infrastructure, but a completely reasonable expense for the province adding this new infrastructure if we could get it in place. In the long run, if we allow for new capital investment to come in, we allow for labor migration, we allow the economy to sort of react to this over a longer period where we can get these ducks in a row a little bit better, you can get an up to 2.5% increase in provincial GDP. Now that's a level increase, so that means every year we're producing goods that are worth 2.5% more. That has implications for the welfare of the rest of Canada as well, because they can benefit from accessing our goods. Albertans at the household level would have substantially higher average incomes. There are lots of benefits from this. And it doesn't just focus on sort of a legacy industry like oil and gas, not throwing oil and gas out, but if we're increasing other modes, we can focus on some of the other stuff that Alberta does well. And I think that's really important. So when we have conversations, which we do, about groups in central Alberta or northern Alberta about this, they get very excited at this because this is a real issue for them, not just being able to get their goods out to market, but being able to get inputs into those regions so that they're able to produce and so that they're able to increase quality of life by buying things at a lower cost. You know, we know cost of living increases the further north you get in this country. So these are real impacts. GDP is one number and it's an important number, but if we think about the welfare of Albertans, that's a pretty significant impact as well. And so I think that's the last slide I've got. I don't know, Trevor, if you've got anything to add, or we can turn it back to Marcia for Q&A.
No, that sounds great. I guess just to re-emphasize the point that Kent made earlier, that a 1 to 2 to at the high end there, 2.5% gain is significant in an economy of $350 billion per year. So just a 1.5 point gain there is $5 billion per year in additional economic activity, and 2.5% is 9 to 10 billion or so per year. So these are, I think I consider them quite significant gains. And that means the present value of these flows that go from one year to the next are significant. And it's that needs to be compared against the cost of new infrastructure.
Well, great. Thank you very much. There's a lot there to work with, and certainly just tremendously interesting information in the article. I think delving into some new data sources that I hadn't seen for a long, in my experience. So really interesting work. So I'm going to take the first question to sort of the basics, right? and that is, your model shows that increased access to markets increases economic benefits, especially for Alberta, right? As a landlocked jurisdiction and a highly export-focused economy. So the benefits are there. And you also show that reduced trade costs significantly increases Alberta's GDP. So where do those economic benefits accrue? Is this primarily in the natural resource area, oil and gas, agriculture, and some of the export sectors, or is there spillover to other sectors?
Yes, maybe I'll take a first crack at that. And it's important to remember that sectors trade a lot with each other. One sector produces goods that are not themselves final goods that consumers enjoy, but they feed into other sectors' output as an input. So these input-output connections, it turns out, are the majority of trade interprovincially and the majority of trade internationally. So when costs fall, even on items that you and I do not purchase directly, it can cascade through the supply chain, lowering costs throughout the economy. And that's a key way in which gains from trade can be amplified and having those gains spread across multiple sectors. The gains to consumers take multiple forms. I think Kent briefly mentioned this. It's worth repeating that. First, price reductions when it becomes more or lower cost for firms to ship to consumers, or lower cost for firms to access important inputs. That lowers their production costs, which lowers their prices. And so then a consumer can stretch their income over a greater quantity of goods and services. So it's like their real income is rising. But then second, increased productivity and increased demand for products produced here does represent an increase in part in demand for labor. And so wages can rise as well. So you have income increases, price decreases, and productivity gains throughout the economy, not just in the sectors where rail is important.
Okay. Well, speaking of productivity gains, I think, you've done a lot of work on this, Trevor, but the paper also shows that the costs of interprovincial trade barriers, this issue has been well researched, and it's well known that these barriers are a major drag on the Canadian economy and certainly on the Alberta economy. So knowing how important the elimination of those barriers are, why do you think we haven't done more as a federation to address them?
Well, it's important to keep in mind what these trade barriers are. They take many, many forms, and they're often not explicit protectionist measures in the same way that, say, a tariff on imports from abroad would be. So many types of interprovincial trade barriers take the form of just differences in the rules and regulations that prevail in one province compared to another. That adds some frictions to businesses trying to operate in multiple jurisdictions. It introduces some extra costs maybe to have a good inspected multiple times. If it's going into a province, agricultural goods face this, where there's provincial and federal inspections, and you might, if you ship across provinces, have to go through 3 different inspection regimes. Now that's just largely because provinces within areas of their own jurisdiction converge on different rules sometimes. And there's a great deal of work right now under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement to try and identify the costliest forms of regulatory differences and work to harmonize them. That's a very slow process, as you can imagine. But another type of interprovincial trade costs that we focus on here in the paper is just transportation costs, infrastructure. And this, we spend a lot of time in Alberta thinking about pipeline capacity constraints and can see the implications of that in a very real way on limiting export capacity in that sector. But infrastructure really spans the whole range from road, rail, pipelines, electricity transmission lines, telecommunication infrastructure to facilitate professional services trade, if you will. So there's a lot of potential for lowering the costs of interprovincial trade by expanding infrastructure construction. Now well, first, it's not easy because there are regulatory hurdles that proponents need to go through. And that's one of the benefits of a corridor, to try and ease that regulatory burden by pre-designating, as Kent described earlier, a route where within that route, construction of infrastructure can be easier than constructing it just on regular land, if you will. And sorry.
So I was just going to say, great points. I'm sorry to cut you off. I think there's also a potential coordination failure in some of these modes as well. And so that's a slightly loaded term. I'm going to say something slightly controversial. I think this is an area where pipelines actually worked quite well until they didn't anymore. That we had a federal regulator on pipelines. There were fewer larger actors in that space to motivate interest in constructing a line. If you think about something like road or rail, and in particular industries where you've got lots of smaller players, if I run an auto parts store in central Alberta, I'm not in a position where I think, man, it would be a whole lot better if I could get my imports via a paved highway or a rail line that went through to Manitoba, because I'm just one small auto parts store. And the thing is, you can start adding that up, and there are enough people that it makes sense, but there's a lack of coordination to get them all to the table and say, yeah, we want a rail line. And so I think this sort of lack of longer term planning is a big issue with these physical constraints, that you end up shipping on higher cost modes or on longer routes than you would have if we had better planning, just because we don't have a centralized planning structure. And Canada really hasn't done much of that since the 1960s, 1970s. I don't know, Alaz, do you have thoughts on sort of the history of that?
On the history of lack of coordination in terms of your infrastructure. Yeah, that's true. One example that I can think of is currently the rail that goes to Port of Churchill, for example. So that's definitely an issue, just integration, efficiency, and lack of it.
I don't know if our moderator might be frozen.
Are you?
Oh, there we go. Sorry,
Oh,
Marcia.
sorry.
I don't know if it was everyone, but you cut out there for me.
Oh,
Sorry.
I think it was my connection here. I could use some infrastructure to learn more where I'm currently living to improve my bandwidth. But okay, so let's talk about rail, because rail is a really important conclusion that you reach in your paper, that by increasing rail capacity, you could have upwards of a 10% benefit to the economy. So, increasing rail shipments would overall lower transportation costs for products that have to travel significant distances. And a couple of the questions in my Q&A box go to, well, if that's clear, then why aren't rail companies expanding right now? In my experience, the objectives of the rail companies aren't aligned with some of the shippers and the producers, right? So by constraining rail capacity, they can actually charge higher tolls, higher fees, and can kind of exercise a bit of a monopolistic activity in the market. We've seen for years that in the agriculture sector, serious concern about the lack of rail cars and lack of capacity to ship grain. What's the likelihood of rail companies taking this up, because it may not be in their economic benefit?
Yeah, I think the market power argument is a relevant one, that rail companies are going to do what's profitable. That's their mandate. I mean, they have a responsibility to shareholders on that. But I think back to one of the points that Trevor made, I mean, we have a number of regulations on this kind of linear infrastructure. They're there for a reason. This is not an argument to throw out the regulations, because they are important each regulation had a reason behind it when it originally went into place, and most of those are still valid. So I think you've got these sort of dual impacts. You've got a potential market power issue where it might not be in their best interest to add too much new line, too much new fixed capacity. And there's also an issue that they are dealing with a similar form of the same type of regulatory burden that other types of investment are. So the corridor concept can help the second one of those for sure in reducing that regulatory underbrush, giving a little bit more certainty, having a clear institution to handle this type of investment. On the market power issue, I don't think it's a surprise that if you look through the history of rail construction in Canada, our major rail lines have all had federal government involvement, right? And often direct financial involvement from a federal government, because it's a sort of build it and they will come type scenario, or this idea where you need a loss leader that you subsidize the line earlier on. And so you look back at the history of the Canadian Pacific Main Line, that was a heavily subsidized line when it was originally constructed, but eventually it started paying good dividends, and we're still seeing those dividends well over a century later. So that's not a reason not to do it, but it is a reason that the private sector, without, a little bit of a nudge, or maybe use the carrot instead of the stick, why they may not be interested in jumping with both feet themselves. And so again, I think this goes back to the idea that we need to think more seriously about planning infrastructure for the whole country, and thinking about how we can line up those carrots to get a combination of private and public sector to the table.
And I'll just quickly follow up there, and also, I guess, directly speak to Josh's question there in the Q&A around how do we actually increase infrastructure capacity? And that's something that we are agnostic around in the paper. In any kind of project of this scale and scope, detailed cost-benefit analysis is certainly required, and we're focused on the benefit side of that equation and the benefits to the broader overall economy. And so this is an important part, but just one part of this broader question. And now, given the magnitude of the benefits that we identify economically in the long term, just from a 10 percentage point increase in rail shipment capacity of 9 billion per year. So the present value of that is, I guess, depending on the discount rate that you use, let's say $200 billion or something. So these are significant gains in present value terms. And that means it is very important then to start thinking about the how. We could have very well have found the broader economic gains would be modest and small, suggesting that maybe then effort towards working through the important detailed questions around how to get it done wouldn't be worth pursuing. But I think we find that given the scale of the benefits, it is absolutely worth thinking now about how. Maybe a 10 percentage point increase in rail shipment capacity is too large, not feasible. And so our paper goes through and does a wide range of scenarios to try and quantify what the benefits are from just a 1 percentage point increase, from a 5 point, from a 10 point, and other types of experiments as well we explore in the paper. So how, whether it's building new lines, which is kind of the intent of the corridor to facilitate, or whether it's capacity improvements on existing lines to get more modest increases in rail shipment capacity, that is something where work would be done in the future on.
Great, thanks. It's hard to talk about a corridor and infrastructure development in this province and not talk about pipelines. I know your paper didn't specifically address that, but certainly my experience and tells me that rail becomes attractive in the oil space when pipelines aren't available. And when there are pending pipeline approvals, it is sort of less desirable for the producers, and certainly less interesting to the rail companies, because rail companies are in the business of looking for long-term stable contracts, because as one of our questioners mentioned, the entry costs into rail are so high. The purchase of rail cars, the establishment and construction of shipping stations, and all the infrastructure that goes with that. So I know your paper didn't specifically talk about that differential between pipelines and rail, but isn't it relevant? Because if you were to have, say, 2 new pipelines come in, wouldn't that significantly affect the economics of rail?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it would significantly affect. Well, I mean, that's a speculative question. I think So I'll explain one of the reasons why we didn't deal with it much in the paper, and this is because our counterfactual is based on this idea that for longer distances, rail is cheaper than road transportation, right? And for crude oil, it's the other way around, that rail is more expensive than pipelines. So simulating that increase wasn't really relevant. Now, rail is seeing demand from crude by rail sector, and we know from at least some anecdotal reports that this can hit seasonal crunch points, and so the agricultural industry in particular has voiced displeasure that during crunch times in agriculture, when they're trying to get, say, grain to market, that those shipments end up being delayed because the crude oil shipments are more lucrative. So I think there probably is an argument to be made there in terms of aggregate volume. But when we think about new rail accessing new parts of the province, I don't know that there's a huge impact on those trunk lines, especially for a lot of these goods that don't face these same seasonal crunch points. You know, if you have a choice and you can ship any time in a fiscal quarter, then it's not a big issue where you're going to hit the peak load problem that grain does. And so again, this is a little bit speculative because it's hard to get really good data on sort of weekly shipments, but I don't think that that's a huge negative that, you know, if we get new pipelines, suddenly the market for rail disappears, because I think the market for rail, at least the part that we're talking about here, is more for branch lines and lines that go north, where you'd be accessing different industries in new parts of the province. And so if anything, you know, having better access to the trunk lines would probably be good on that front. But again, very speculative answer because it's not something we've looked at directly, but it's a great question and something that maybe we should be thinking about in future research. I don't know, Alaz, Trevor, do you guys have anything to add there? Okay.
Great, thank you. Well, let's talk a little bit more about markets, right? You were talking about how important it is to open up new markets. And I think the paper goes so far as to say that priority should be placed on increasing access to underserved US and international markets when we think about this kind of infrastructure corridor. So what about the argument that what Alberta actually needs to do is diversify its markets away from the US, that the fact that we have essentially a single consumer for many of our exported products actually drives down price and harms our competitive position? What's your thought on that?
I think that's exactly the intent of highlighting the lack of diversity in terms of the markets that we serve. There are gains from having a diverse portfolio of markets for one's products, which we don't quantify in the paper directly, but it's less risk if you have diverse markets, because if developments change in one market and that is the dominant source of your exports, then you're exposed to those risks. And so shifting into other markets abroad or other markets within the United States by having infrastructure that can access underserved markets elsewhere, then it limits your exposure to that potential risk. And I think in Alberta's case, being so highly concentrated relative to other provinces, that's one of the real diversification challenges that we face, that thinking about expanding infrastructure capacity to allow for other markets to be more easily accessed has quite a bit of value, and value that, though we didn't quantify, is very meaningful.
Great, thank you.
Can I just say
Alaz.
something? This reminds me of so expanding infrastructure capacity comes with also about this diversification comes with expanding capacity in the ports as well. So for example, and also integrating different lines. So again, it reminds me again of Port of Churchill and the need to expand capacity over there, and the advantage of expanding capacity in Port of Churchill for reaching other markets, especially in Europe, through that line. Also, Port of Prince Rupert, for example, as another, yeah. So just expanding rail capacity is probably not enough for that diversification, but it also requires thinking about expanding the gateways that those lines go to.
I'm going to sneak in one other quick point on this one too. We spend so much time, particularly in Alberta, thinking about international export markets as sort of the only markets that matter. But there's a large potential to access other markets inside of Canada, right? And both for imports and for exports. I mean, trade between Alberta and, say, Ontario, we currently lack an oversized shipping route. So if you're making something or trying to ship something that's quite large, the specific example would be like vessels for the oil sands. Ontario really isn't a feasible market for Alberta right now because of the shipping delays, because of how much time it takes to get permitting just for transportation. That you can get a vessel manufactured in South Korea and shipped to Alberta through the United States faster than you can buy one from Ontario. And the manufacturing part is those cost differences can be negligible, but it's the transportation delays and having to wait to get these things here. So when we think about, markets and trade, one thing that I want to leave the audience with is think about other provinces in Canada as trading markets as well, right? Because we could do more of that. It's not just about selling internationally. We could sell more to other provinces in Canada, and we can buy more from them if we had better transportation infrastructure. And, that might help with a host of other things in some of the issues that we have with the Federation right now and not thinking about Canada as an integrated economy.
Well, I just want to build on that point, Kent, because I think the model showed there were significant enduring economic benefits to the creation of a corridor of this nature, right? Up to 6% increase in real personal income for every Albertan family, and I think $6,423 annually for, every Albertan family. So these are enduring and significant economic benefits that are clear for Alberta. And I think what you showed is that about 2/3 of the overall benefit from this kind of corridor would accrue to Alberta and 1/3 to the rest of Canada. Is that right? Can you pick that apart a little bit, what the 2/3 and the 1/3 represent, and then what the implications of that kind of distribution have for jurisdictions being interested in pursuing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think really critical to all this is, again, this idea that trade by definition goes both ways. And we spend so much time, especially in this province, fixated on exports, whether that's for the oil industry or any other industry. We talk about exports and finding markets and all that stuff. But trade doesn't work if you're just selling to someone. You have to buy stuff too, right? I mean, this is how all kinds of economic trade works. This is the definition of trade. It goes both ways. We get the dollars, we use them to spend on foreign goods, all this kind of stuff. And so when you look at these gain shares between Alberta and the rest of Canada, when we lower those trade costs, even if we're just lowering the costs to, say, export, and the simulations, we do both, we lower the export costs and the import costs. But even if you were just doing one, we benefit from an increased market size because it's less expensive to ship our goods to other provinces. They benefit because they can buy the good at a lower price too, right? So as we reduce the transportation costs, that wedge between what they have to buy it at and what we get to sell it at, that shrinks. So it can literally be a win-win where they pay less and we get to keep more of what they pay because we have these lower costs. And that's why this trade cost stuff is so critical when we think about integrated economies or economies that could be better integrated like Canada's, because you can actually reduce that wedge between the two and both sides can win. Now, we've simulated an impact directly on Alberta, so it's not a surprise that Alberta gets the lion's share of the gains we're projecting. But if we were doing this for all the provinces across Canada, I mean, you really would get this rising tides lifts all ships. I think we haven't done that simulation, so I can't say for sure, but just by the logic of the model and the logic of all the theory we have from trade, we know when we sign free trade agreements and when we do that, we can increase the size of the economic pie. I don't know, Trevor, Alaz, you guys do more trade than I do. Do you want to jump in?
I think at this point, it's really important to remember also the input-output relationships that also extra amplifies that impact that you're talking about, because you buy your inputs cheaper because of the decrease in transportation costs. But at the same time, like, you can also sell them with a lower transportation cost. So the effect for all provinces even amplifies. Also, thinking about labor as well, like demand for labor.
Yeah, great point.
And I'll just add some of the I guess, quantitative context here, in that gain to Alberta that we described earlier in the long run of 2.5% to real GDP if rail export shares increased by 10 percentage points. Nationally, the gain, so that's about a 9 billion per year gain to Alberta. Nationally, the gains are about 15 billion. So that's where the 2/3 going to Alberta comes from. And that's 6 billion per year in economic activity increases elsewhere in the country. About 10% of the national gain goes to British Columbia and another 10% to Ontario. So facilitating even just lower cost exports from Alberta through increased rail capacity in that 10 percentage point scenario is $1.5 billion per year to BC's real GDP, $1.5 billion to Ontario's real GDP, which relative to Ontario's larger size is less of a percentage gain, but that's significant increases in economic activity from lowering cost of export from Alberta.
Great, Trevor, I might just ask you to answer this one from the audience. And the question is really, is Alberta's trade really that geographically concentrated? And, he refers to an index that seems to be the result of the location of Enbridge's 2 oil terminals in the US and that actual locations of various locations of various economic transactions. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure can. And actually, I will cite another paper published through the School of Public Policy back in 2016, I believe, with myself and colleague, former professor here, Robert Mansell. And we go through and actually construct this Herfindahl Index across products and across sectors for each of Canada's provinces in terms of their export markets. At least that year, that Herfindahl Index was for Alberta, if I'm remembering correctly, and forgive me, it has been a few years, is the second highest or Alberta has the second highest Herfindahl Index by a wide margin relative to others. And the highest is in the most concentrated would be New Brunswick, where they also have very, very concentrated exports elsewhere. There's certainly lots of reasons for that. And that is primarily because energy is a very large share of Alberta's export, and energy is very concentrated to flow towards those Midwestern refineries through a lot of the pipelines that exist from Alberta to that market. So there are certainly reasons why we have such highly concentrated exports, but measured in that precise way with a Herfindahl Index indeed shows that we have a very concentrated distribution of exports across markets.
Great. Well, another question related to trade and trade patterns. One of the audience members is asking about our fixation in Western Canada in particular on China, but aren't we forgetting about Europe and Africa? And is that because we face particular barriers heading east? And would this infrastructure corridor help us with accessing some of those markets to the east?
That's a great question. So I wouldn't say that we're fixated on Asia so much. Over the past few years, there has been large increases in the number of opportunities in Asia for, in particular, agricultural producers here in Alberta. I'm thinking about beef in particular, and the dramatic declines in tariffs on beef exports from Alberta that the Trans-Pacific Partnership will be facilitating. So there's some legitimately large opportunities for a very important sector in Alberta to Asian markets. And, our exports to Europe, you can certainly export through air there easily relative to even exporters in Eastern Canada. But for rail, that would need to proceed to a port on the East Coast, for example. And we do a lot of that. About $1.4 billion of rail exports from Alberta, for example, currently go to Montreal. And maybe a good fraction of that would then be loaded onto cargo ships for exports abroad, and increased rail infrastructure can expand and facilitate that type of export as well. Of course, subject to Alaz's earlier excellent point that port capacity may also need to increase in that scenario. But the orientation of Western economies towards Asian markets and the orientation of Eastern economies to European ones is kind of a natural consequence of distance as well, and is not surprising in that context. And then in addition, the comparative advantage that we have in many agricultural goods that are demanded by those Asian markets, whose tariffs are falling fairly rapidly over the next couple of years, means I think it's not a fixation so much as a real opportunity.
Okay. Well, let me take us back to rail, and I'm going to combine a couple of questions here on rail. One questioner suggests that railways have divested over 30,000 kilometers of track over the last 3 decades. So the question is it really useful then to talk about new corridor development when all the current activity and I guess the economics are suggesting that rail corridors are shrinking? And in the light of that kind of dynamic, who would be the stakeholder responsible to kind of push this kind of integrated planning, integrated system forward in the face of some of these dynamics?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think you probably need government at the table in some form or another. And again, that's partly because of the coordination failure issue I was mentioning earlier, that our research here shows that there is a potentially large economic benefit there, but it's thinking about, who gets the share of that, and are you going to compensate a rail line operator fairly? But the other thing to point out is that there are current plans at various stages for new rail, particularly in Western Canada, right? And so, a couple of months ago, we heard a lot about the Alberta to Alaska line because there was, it got issued a presidential permit, and there's support out of Alaska for that at their government level, and support from the Alberta government as well. So there are these other plans. And so the fact that there has been divestiture of some of these smaller branch lines, I don't think that that's a huge sort of hole in the side of the idea of adding more rail capacity through a corridor, but it is a case of how do you structure these things, how do you organize them, right? And we do have a history again of that in Canada as well, right? You look at early days of the Canadian National Railway, it was sort of stitched together out of some branch lines. I mean, there was other impacts in that as well, but smaller individual branch lines that couldn't make a go of it independently. And so you get Crown ownership of that, and they start consolidating and setting them up, because there's a lot in terms of economies of scale and economies of scope that a single branch line that was built for a single reason, if it was just built to say haul something back from a mine mouth or something like that, may become an unfeasible piece of infrastructure to maintain. But if you think longer term and planning something out, like the Canadian Pacific Main Line or like the CN Railway, once they actually started thinking about the main line as a consolidated system, the economics of those things change. And so here again, I'll go back, and I know I sound like a broken record, but I think a lot of this is thinking seriously about long-term planning for this infrastructure, rather than thinking about, a one-off project proponent that, well, I'm going to build a railway here because I have a use for it for the next 20 years. Well, that gets you 20 years of a rail line, but it doesn't get you 150 years of a rail line, which is what we get when we do long-term planning like the CP main line. And one other thing I'll mention is, and then I'll open it up, because I think Alaz or Trevor are giving me the high sign that they might want to add something here. But another thing when you think about rail is, if you plan it properly, you get benefits all along the line, right? And this is a problem that we've seen with pipelines in particular as well. The pipelines are a great technology for transporting crude oil, but once they're in the ground, there's a benefit at one end of the pipeline and a benefit at the other end of the pipeline. That's not a reason not to do them when they make sense, but it is a reason that we think about social acceptability, and we think about longer term viability of these as sort of multimodal shipping. The benefit is in stitching these communities together, almost quite literally on the map, by putting the rail lines. So you need to plan, you need to figure out how do we create the most economic benefit for the lowest cost, and think about it as a 50 or 100 or 150 year asset instead of a 10 or a 20 year asset.
I just want to mention the difference between rail versus other types of infrastructure modes. So planning is extra important for rail because for it to be efficient, for it to be profitable for the companies operating it, some maybe from governments. So there are additional infrastructure that needs to be built and planned together with planning of the actual rail line. For example, deep water ports, icebreakers if you want to go to Europe or connect to Europe from a rail line. So there are so many pieces that really need to come together for a rail line to be planned for longer term. So I think that the responsibility is not only on the operators in this case, because it is a bit more complicated compared to other types of infrastructure.
I'm going to jump back in because I can't help it, and that's a great point, Alaz. And again, this is a historical reference to the CP rail. If you think about the early days of that company, right? I mean, they had steamship lines, they had hotels, they ran all of their, and it was this idea of economies of scope, because you're absolutely right. In the early days, you needed all that, and the only way to organize it was through a single private company. I think if we had better national planning through the corridor as an institution, you could do that and have multiple independent companies doing it, but there needs to be some coordination, some planning there. Yeah, great point. Thanks very much.
So Kent, talking about some national planning and national coordination, a couple of years ago, I believe it was the Council of Federation as well as First Minister's meeting, there was nationwide support for further exploring this notion of, I think at that time they were calling it an energy corridor, but I'm sure this broader concept of an infrastructure corridor aligns with that. Are you aware of any progress that the governments are making on that, or any tangible results that you're seeing out of that agreement?
Yeah, so I mean, we know that there's interest, and you mentioned the Council of the Federation. They had a statement after, I believe it was their last meeting, or maybe the one before that, in general support. And so in all the groups that we're talking to, I think there is support here. There's occasionally frustration in the fact that stuff isn't moving faster, but I think this really is a case where you need to do the due diligence. We're halfway through or not quite halfway through a 5-year research program at the school on this. And I think there's danger in actually trying to move too fast on this. I mean, support is great, and we're always happy to get support and get input and get feedback. But jumping with both feet kind of violates this idea of planning this out and longer term planning. So yeah, there is interest. There was a Senate report in 2016 or so on the idea. The federal government has launched their National Trades Corridors Fund. I believe there's some other federal initiatives coming through, but I can't recall the specifics, so I won't try to second guess myself on that one. And yes, the Council of the Federation is looking at this. They had that positive statement after one of their last meetings, and I believe they're still continuing to put some time and effort into that. Of course, COVID has disrupted a lot of this because you've got working groups on that, which obviously should be the priority. And that goes back to my idea of, I don't think it's in anyone's best interest to push this too quickly or to try to push this too quickly, because if you start making decisions without doing your due diligence, they're going to be the wrong decisions. If we get in that headspace where we're thinking about 50 or 100 or 150 year assets, we can afford a little bit more time up front to plan it correctly to make sure we're getting the positive benefit over the next century or couple of centuries, rather than jumping in and getting 20 years and then having it fall apart.
Absolutely. So in the last few minutes that we have left, I wondered if you folks might comment on some of the pending research, some of the additional work that is coming our way to help support this project over the long term.
Sure. Now you're putting me on the spot because I got to remember what we're actually doing. I know one of the things that we're looking into quite seriously is thinking more about some of the social impacts rather than just the pure economic ones. So I mean, economic, the stuff we talked about today that you can measure in dollar values, GDP and personal incomes, and those are important. But there's also access to social services and intercommunity relationships. One of the studies that we've been working on for quite a while, but we are making progress, is looking at how the Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk Highway has impacted those communities, because they're very isolated communities and there are lots of economic benefits, but there are lots of social benefits too. One of my favorite stories is talking about the local hockey teams that can actually play against each other now because they can get from one community to another, right? And so that's something it's particularly Canadian to think about, but these are important aspects of linking those more remote communities. So we're looking at that kind of research. We're also thinking more about environmental impacts, so species at risk. If you're going to put corridors through northern Canada and you want to do it properly, you do have to think about those species. There are costs to this that we have to weigh against the benefits. So there's some research there. Alaz has already mentioned Arctic shipping. That's another area. So I don't know, Alaz, do you want to talk just briefly about that?
The Arctic shipping is it's a complicated story, but so it is. Currently, for example, Canada needs more icebreakers, for example, just to start the trade in the Northwest Passage, just to make Port of Churchill more useful for trade, or even before starting to invest in this kind of infrastructure. I think the first thing you need to do, and I'm seeing the government is actually willing to do something about it, is to assess what we have and see what is missing and where the opportunities are. So currently, the federal government announced an infrastructure assessment that they're starting to do. I think that's very valuable. We are also doing something similar, doing research on the existing and planned infrastructure in Canada. What else are we doing? Oh, of course, we are currently also working on the long-term trade patterns to see where the opportunities lie and in the future, which can also help with planning of this type of infrastructure.
So anyone who's interested in that, you can go to the CanadianCorridor.ca website, and on the research page, we have current publications, which are all open to the public, including this paper, and also a list of research themes. And we are planning for multiple, or have planned for multiple studies under each of those themes. So that gives sort of an indication of the breadth of the research that we're doing and that we have planned.
Well, thank you all. I think that's all we have time for today, unfortunately, but that was an incredibly enlightening discussion. I think it brought to light a number of really important considerations for the corridor development. And I would also say it gave me a short but accessible lesson on the computational general equilibrium model, which was very helpful for me. So thanks to all the panel members, and thank all of you in the audience for joining us today. And as Ken said, all the information related to this panel and other related research is available on the School of Public Policy website. And I wish you all a very good day. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.